Welcome back to another episode of Unseen Pain. I'm your host, Emily Weldon, a licensed mental health therapist. In today's episode, we confront debate surrounding criminal justice and bail reform, spotlighting the significant impact on family members and loved ones. At the forefront of this discussion, Ken W. Good, a seasoned legal expert with deep understanding of the complexities within our justice system. When considering bail reform, it is important to consider the impacts that reform has on the public. Are offenders released more likely to reoffend? How does this impact cases involving violent crimes such as domestic violence? There are so many questions about public safety and victim protection to consider. To help us gain more insight into this topic, Ken Good is joining us today, and we will explore these very questions. With his wealth of experience and legal expertise, Ken provides insights into the intersection of law, policy, and community welfare. Please note that the views expressed by guests on this podcast did not necessarily reflect the beliefs of myself, Unseen Pain, or Mindful Solutions. Guest opinions are intended to provide insights and information. Thank you for your understanding. Hi, Ken. Thank you for being with us today on Unseen Pain.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Yes. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about you, what you do, and I guess what brought you here to Unseen Pain today?
Well, I think probably what I would start with is I'm a father of two girls. I'm married. My wife and I are both attorneys, which I don't know what that says about us. But I think probably that's my thing I would like to highlight the most. My youngest daughter had a bone marrow transplant when she was 5. She is now just finished her first year of college, and her platelets are now normal, so she's doing well. She was born with some arm issues, and still we still have those, but she's a great child, great kid, and we are different parents and different individuals than we were before we went through that. Now, other than family, I'm an attorney. I've been practicing for over 30 years. I started out representing doctors in hospitals when they got sued, and then transitioned and developed this practice representing bail bond issues or bail issues or criminal justice reform issues. I'm a member of the board of the Professional Bondsmen of Texas. I go before the legislature. I testify on bills. I'm going to be in Austin in 2 days to testify before a committee. And, because of what we call criminal justice bail reform some 5 or 6 years ago, I decided we had to become experts on these issues because no one was telling what I perceived to be the real story, the truth. And so I set about doing that. I've been published many times on these types of issues and spoken about them a lot. And this is something that I guess I've become passionate about because we call it criminal justice reform, but it's really not criminal justice reform. It's not bail reform. It's the undoing of criminal justice. And I think the more more data we get, the more we are convinced that we get more and more truths that there are people that know what they're doing is causing more crime, and they're okay with it. And so we need to point that out.
It sounds like in a way then it's more about, from your perspective, it's more about preventing more crime from occurring.
Yes. The mayor of New York, who I would not say would be a political ally, he said recently on a podcast that one of the foundations of society is public safety. And if you cannot provide public safety, then you do not have a society. I would go further and say, if the government will not provide public safety, the public will demand it itself. And so we will either get it from the government or we will get it from vigilante. Because the public will demand it. And we're kind of in that area where the government is kind of refusing to provide it in our urban areas. And we're seeing the ramifications of that and the pushback.
Talk to us then about the prevalence of how bail reform then impacts the prevalence and severity, maybe even, of domestic violence.
Well, before all this bail reform movement and criminal justice reform movement from, several years ago, and also, the way it has taken or the path it's taken in our urban areas, I would say domestic violence survivors already had a lack of trust in the government, in the criminal justice system, because, the government, the protections that were being provided were, we'll give you a protective order, but we really can't do anything to them until they violate it. And sometimes the violation of it is death or severe injury or, just on and on and on. With these reforms that we're seeing, I've heard just horror stories. You no longer can take the time to even try to trust the government or the court system. You need to first and foremost run, get your exit plan, provide for your own safety, because in these reforms in our urban areas, they're not even going to hold them. I mean, the most radical case I've heard is the case of Caitlin Guajardo in Harris County in Houston, where her husband was already on one of these simple release mechanisms, and he got arrested for hurting her, and then immediately got released again, and within hours killed her and stabbed her 30 something times in her stomach because she was pregnant. And he stated to the police he did it because he didn't want anyone else raising his child. And so now he's in jail, waiting to go to trial for, capital murder, for murder. I mean, he before criminal justice reform, he would have not been released within hours on a simple release mechanism. I mean, he would have been in jail for several days, and that would have been a cooling off period. And his family would have gotten involved in some way to say, calm down. But because of these release mechanisms where they don't care, they just want his people to out of jail as quickly as possible. I mean, you wonder whether people are even going to get sober if they're drunk when they get in jail before they're released. And so we're seeing the consequences of that across the spectrum on these violence types of issues. And part of the problem is that leads to a large dismissal rate. A large dismissal rate leads to a lack of credibility on these types of charges to begin with from the judge. Well, why should I spend time on this? Because it's just going to be dismissed. So it dilutes the credibility of these offenses, when the opposite should be true. We should be setting up mechanisms for the protection of the family, for the protection of the person who's making these allegations, and we're doing the opposite.
Mm-hmm. It seems like, and maybe this is not true, but that there's a little bit of almost minimizing of domestic violence. Like, it's not seen as maybe a serious issue until it becomes a very serious issue, right? Where there is then someone's life taken, or
especially when we're in our urban areas and they've downloaded or downgraded it to a misdemeanor. And in our urban areas, well, we don't prosecute misdemeanors right now anyway. Look at Harris County. They've got an 80% failure to appear rate on misdemeanors across the board in misdemeanor court. That's according to HarrisCountyCourtWatch.com. I mean, if you've got an 80% failure to appear rate, your criminal justice system is about to collapse. And so the only way you're preventing it from collapse is you're dismissing all the cases, which is what they're doing.
What about then, how does a victim, or how do they navigate the legal system? Because I can imagine that's a really overwhelming process for someone who's just trying to stay safe.
Well, I would say currently, especially if you're in our urban areas, you can't navigate the legal system. That has to be your second goal. Your first goal needs to be exit strategy, your support, setting up your support system, and providing for you, and if you have family, your family's needs over the next period of time. And so you've got to do all that first, and then come back to the criminal justice system after you've set up all those safeguards, protections, and for your future.
Mm-hmm. What about when you think of adjustments then that might be necessary moving forward? How do you envision that in your line of work?
It's going to be very difficult right now because the tide is, in some places, the tide is still pushing to the left. It is starting to slow down and starting to kind of being pushed back to the right in some areas. Texas is one of them where it's been pushing back to the right. But in our big urban areas, like look at Houston, the current sitting DA in Houston was supported by Soros 2 elections ago, and then she decided they went too far. So one election ago, she was not supported by them. And then in the primary in March, just this year, they put up somebody to run against her and gave them $4 million and they beat her. And so the message is very clear to these progressive DAs. If you receive money for us, you're going to do what we ask. And if you don't, then we're going to put up somebody to run against you. And so we're going to have to address that. One of the ways Texas is addressing it is if they kind of follow these crazy schemes that Soros is asking them to follow, they can be removed from office. Like, I mean, can you imagine you get elected to DA? The DA is the voice for the victim in the courtroom, but you get elected with support from Soros. So then you're sent an invitation to a seminar by a group that's initially said don't have anything to do with Soros, but now we know they are. And when you go, they go like, these are the things that a progressive DA does. You don't prosecute minors as adults, even if the law says you can't. You don't seek long sentences. You don't do drug enhancements or any enhancements on crime. So like a drug dealer that's found with 40 pounds of meth, you just prosecute him as a possession of drugs. So that's 2 weeks in jail, maybe, instead of 20 years, and on and on and on. And one of the things you do is you support bail reform. And that's a litmus test if you receive money from them. And that's creating problems from DAs. We had one recalled, another one's in the process of being recalled. Gascon in LA would have been recalled, but they invalidated many signatures. He's so disliked at the moment that he only received 25% of the vote in the primary. And California has its own list system. The top 2 vote getters go to the second round. He was still one of the top 2 vote getters, but he only got 25% of the vote running for re-election in the primary. So you would think that the likelihood of him winning is very, very low. So you would expect it to get very ugly, and they're going to paint their opponent as everything else but them. And you see that across the country. I mean, look at New York. You know, the person who just successfully prosecuted Trump, he was a Soros supported DA. They had originally declined the charges, and then they brought in someone from the Biden White House, and then they decided to change their mind, and the rest is history. And so here's the problem. When you start being very selective on what you prosecute, in the end, it becomes very politicized. And so you end up only prosecuting your political enemies. Or I would say, let's soften it a little bit and say you get to where you're subject to attack, that all you prosecute are your political enemies. And like Gascon made a statement one time that, you know, the real victim is the criminal that's been accused of the crime. Well, think about that. When you've got the DA saying the real victim is the defendant, and you got the defense attorney saying the real victim is the defendant, who is arguing? Who's the voice of the domestic violence survivor in that case? Nobody. And if you can't count on the DA to be your voice in the courtroom, that means there isn't one. And that means you can't rely upon the courts.
What then, when you think of law enforcement agencies, prosecutors, even just anything within the judicial system as well, what do you feel like can be done to help ensure safety, well-being, even just resources? Because I keep hearing also just a lack of resources for survivors, and that alone is an issue.
Well, I would start with what's your backup system? Who are you going to rely upon to help you? You know, and by and large, a lot that's family. So I would say, do you have family you can fall back and lean on? If you do, even if it's not a great situation, it's still the best chance you have at making it. I mean, look at all the mental health issues we have now, and we have same issues. I mean, as we do in this area, low resources. Jails end up being the largest mental health facilities in the state. And, I was talking to a group recently, and I said, family is their best chance to survive. Family is their best resource, even if they have gone through 10 years of being out of touch because of the situation, that's still their best chance. I think in this area too, when you need somebody to have your back, I mean, even if you're on the outs, your best chance of making it is family. Where am I going? Who am I staying with? How am I regrouping? And what am I going to do? I mean, do I have to go back to school so that I can be able to provide a living for my kids? Do I need to go see a lawyer? Do I need to rely upon family to help me go see a lawyer so that we can set up child support? Um, how do we get that done? Because there's going to, I've always heard, when you go through a divorce, there's a period of time where you go crazy. I think this is even this on hyperdrive. There's a period of time where you're not thinking clearly. And so I used to tell people don't make big financial decisions until a year after one of these um, stressful situations happens. But I don't know in this situation where you have a year, you've got to get away. You've got to protect yourself. You got to protect your family, and you've got to figure out a system that's going to have your back. And if you've got friends, great. But it's kind of like in the bail world, if you keep getting arrested, the first people that are going to fall away are your friends. Your family's going to stick with you the longest. And then we go to what can the court system do? I mean, I think once you set up your system, your a system of help and how you're going to live for a while, so that you're stable, then you can go to the courts and say, "I need your help," or "I need to file charges." And obviously, we also want to document things so that if you've got evidence of abuse, you want to document it, and you want to document it before you leave, and so they can't say you're playing games. I mean, because they're going to say, if you leave, set up in the system, go somewhere else, take the kids, and file for divorce, you know what the response is going to be? They're just trying to help themselves in their divorce, and so you got to address all those stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably the biggest one. And you just, keep your head up straight, held high, and know who you are. And probably get to counseling pretty quickly. I mean, there's nothing wrong with going to counseling to keep your head on straight, so that you've got your eye on the ball and you're going towards the ball and you don't get distracted, because it's really easy to during those times. I can just say when we went through our bone marrow transplant with my youngest daughter, it was a terrible time. But we tried to keep our sense of humor, and we knew our eye on the ball was to get through it so that she could receive her new bone marrow and start building making more new blood or plasma and platelets and all those things. And we just had to get through it. And I remember the day the doctors came to us and said, your daughter's the sickest child in Children's Hospital in Dallas, and she's the sickest child in the NICU at Children's Hospital, and she may not make it through the day. I think there's a lot of similarities. The stress is just incredible. And you've got to be willing to lean on people, whether it's a friend or whether it's family. I don't know if I think leaning on a new person that's going to take the old person's place is smart, because sometimes we make bad decisions when that happens, and we replace one bad guy or person with another bad person. That may be something we need to address in counseling, but we need to get clear, get out, get safe.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to highlight, family and social support in general is huge in being able to get out of a domestic violence situation. But even if you don't have family and don't have that level of support, there are resources out there still for you, right? There are support groups. There's the National Center for Victims of Crime to help you get resources. Like, there are still people who want to help and are there to help. And so I think that's important to highlight too, because a lot of people in domestic violence situations, especially, in my practice, I've noticed there are a lot of those people initially, they've isolated themselves. Family may have passed away. Family might not even be present. Or family was also perpetrators to them. And so I think it's also important to recognize that, that family piece can be so huge if you have that. But even if you don't, there's still resources and people that want to help. And there are people, like, you are not alone.
I'm not going to minimize that. I mean, I agree with what you've said, and you have to find your support system, whatever it is. But if we're going to rank them, we've already talked about that. And I mean, but if you're going to the system for support, you're going to build a relationship with whoever you're dealing with. That person may be your support system. And so, I mean, I've spoke to groups where people in your chair are saying, I met with this woman and her family, and I met them on a street corner, and they just brought what they could carry, and they jumped in, and I took them to this other place, and I was, their getaway car, and I was their support system. I fully understand that, but you've got to be able to trust. And so if you're going to reach out to a support group that is not family or not friends, then you're going to have to get comfortable with them and know that you can rely upon them, because we've already talked about resources are slim. So you got to make sure you find somebody who's going to be able to satisfy what you need. Because the worst thing you could do is stick your neck out and then find that they can't do what they said they could.
Yeah. What about, in your experience as far as support services and resources then for families, loved ones, or victims of domestic violence? What are some resources that you yourself might know of that maybe we aren't aware of?
Well, I'm in Texas, so I don't know of a lot of groups that are, but always have Crime Stoppers. Crime Stoppers is going to be a big group for helping in victims, any victims. Like the Houston one, Houston Crime Stoppers is a big group, and they have meetings, and so I think that's important. But I'm going to tell you, I would get online and look for groups like domestic violence groups in your area, because you're not. I mean, it doesn't really matter if there's a group in New York that's willing to help you when you're living in Texas. You need to find somebody locally, because you want to stay local. I mean, what the friends you have are local, and uh, your kids are in school local. And if you have to move all that, and you may very well have to, but if you do, you've got to figure out what it is that you need to do and get it done. And those groups have resources that are going to tell you, hey, in our experiences, this is what you should do. And I think that's invaluable. Even if you're dealing with family or friends, I think those groups have the vast amount of knowledge and experience about here's what you should be doing. Here's your checklist. Here's your things that you need to do. 1, 2, 3. And that's invaluable.
What about then we think of, and before we even started recording today, we talked a little bit about that like public awareness piece, right? And so how does public awareness and advocacy, how can we, ramp up that public awareness and the advocacy to be able to then, this needs to be seen, I guess.
Well, we've got some work to do on that, because, look at New York, look at California, especially California. They've been passing some laws for the last 4 or 5 years where they've been saying, oh, we're going to release more criminals from jail, but that's going to make us safer. And look at New York, where they're saying, we know everybody says crime's going up, but it's really not. New York is the safest large city. And there's this perception that crime is going up, but the reality is crime's not. It's going down. All that's a lie. I mean, if you looked at the history of California, you would know that there's these lawsuits that limited their capacity in their state prison system. And as a result, everything they've been doing for the last 4 or 5 years has been to reduce the number of people going to jail, because they have to reduce their capacity. And when you look at it like that, everything they're doing, they don't care about whether it's increasing crime or not. They know they have to reduce the number of people going to jail. And when you look in, I did a podcast with a guy from New York who was talking to the governor's office, and he said, the politicians were saying, we will put up with more crime if we get our political agenda passed. I did a podcast with the DA from Harris County just this week, and she said the same thing. The politicians know what they're doing is increasing crime. They just don't care. They're on a political agenda. And so we're kind of in this area where if the public knew, if if you had to vote, do I vote for more crime to do what they're wanting to do, or do I vote no? You would always vote no. That's the reason why they can't admit it. They can't admit what they're doing is causing more crime or increasing crime. They have to deny it. And so we're in that period of time where now we're having a fight over whether crime's increasing, and that's just ludicrous. All you got to do is look at auto theft statistics. That's the most accurate barometer of whether crime's increasing, because insurance companies still require a submission of a police report to pay off your claim. And that's just god awful what it shows, especially in our urban areas where auto thefts are increasing 25% a year or more, depending on where you live in your urban areas. And so, I mean, we have to get past this period of time. And, we have this little bubble where, they're saying, don't believe them. They're the right. And we're starting to see people on the left saying, no, crime is increasing. Crime is increasing. And so the bubble will burst. And in a lot of ways, what we're seeing is the same thing that happened in the 60s where crime was going down. We felt more safe. We were more forgiving on our criminal laws. Once we were feeling more forgiving, more people got released from jail and crime started going up. And then we had a fight over what to do about it. And one side of the political spectrum said, we're not going to do anything. We're not going to help you do anything. And so it festered for a while and then it blew up. And then we got elected Ronald Reagan with the war on crime. And we seem to be following that same cycle all over again. And I don't know. I mean, I haven't looked to see what was the cycle in the 60s on domestic violence survivors and what was their. I would like to think that then we were a little bit more family oriented, so we provided more support, or there was more of a stigma in society to kind of have an influence on people from doing what they do today. We're redoing the same errors we did in the 60s. We're going to still have those, and we have to get through this period of time and then figure out what we can do. Because the backlash this time is going to be worse than it was last time. And I don't know what that backlash will be, what it will include.
Mm-hmm. If someone's interested then, I guess, in looking up statistics and regards to crime, especially even like domestic violence, how do they find that information?
It's really hard because, like the federal government is saying that, hey, overall crime's going down or the violent offenses are staying steady, or even worse, they'll say, oh, for the last year, it's gone down 10%. But the problem is for the last 4 or 5 years, it's gone up 40%. So it's down 10%, but it's still up 30% from what it was before COVID. And so you have to be very careful because people are misleading about crime. We have this situation going on where identity politics is just killing everything. It's like, oh, you are a woman, so you can't vote for this guy because he believes these things. And so obviously you wouldn't vote for him. Well, wait, I agree with him that crime is increasing. No, it doesn't matter. You can't vote for him because we've identified you as a woman, and we've set up all these things that disqualify me, from ever being voted for by a woman. That's we have that going on as well. And so we still have things to do in that regard. We'll get through this, but I don't know. I mean, I was reading an article recently where they were saying the FBI statistics said crime was going down, and they looked at these cities. And when you went to one of those cities that they said they looked at and relied upon, their local sheriff's office was quoting statistics saying crime's going up. So if you can't rely upon that, what can you rely upon? And that's one of the reasons why I say you have to rely upon car theft statistics, because those are probably the most accurate during this time. I mean, we have to figure out a way to get politics out of it. That's really the killer right now, is politics is impacting everything on this right now.
And it's becoming, and I think this might be similar to what you were saying earlier, it's becoming a very black and white thing, right? It's like you're either this or you're that. And if, something disqualifies you, then you aren't a part of this anymore. And that's just not, we're so much more complex than that.
Well, it is. But what I tell people is right now on crime, we need to have that as a disqualifying issue until people realize that we have to quit lying about crime and we have to start addressing it. And so my advice is we say, I'm not voting for you on any other issue until we resolve this crime issue. If we do that, both sides of the spectrum will find a way to address it for public safety purposes. And we need to do that.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We need those basic needs, that safety first before we can do anything else.
Yes. And you same thing, the immigration issues, very similar. I mean, it's the same politics. And so it's the same thing there. One side says it's not a problem. One side says we don't need borders, but then, who's going to vote in the election? But then when one side loses, oh, we had some illegal people vote. And, it's just so political. It's just become politics every which way you turn. And so we need to address that, get politics out of this. But I'm worried. I don't know how you do that when, you've got billionaires that have discovered that they can influence an election by throwing a couple of million at it, and then they can run it.
What about then if someone is, and I know you mentioned that you had written a book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I have a book that's a practice guide for bail in Texas called Goods on Bail. I've also written over 20 articles that have been published in legal periodicals about the criminal justice issue and bail reform, criminal justice reform, especially as we watch cases go through the criminal justice system. I've written several articles on a case called Daves versus Dallas County, which is probably the preeminent case on bail reform, because, the reformers were all saying, oh, we've got to change what we're doing. Bail's going to be held unconstitutional. Well, not only was it not held unconstitutional, the 11th and the 5th Circuit held that it was. And then, they have this case called O'Donnell where they forced Harris County to do something. And the 5th Circuit ultimately ruled it should have never been filed in federal court, reversed it, but yet they're still following it in Harris County right now. Mm-hmm. And so I've written a lot of articles on that. Harris County is all politics right now. They'll continue to do what they can as long as the state will allow them. The state has changed its laws. They're not following the laws. They're following this settlement, which was a friendly settlement between the county and the plaintiff's attorneys. And the law's changed since then. We've got this ruling saying it should have never been filed in federal court, and yet they're still following it with no intention to follow state law. And that's a problem because it says misdemeanors have to be released on a personal bond. They just get released. And as you know, a lot of time these domestic issues are classified as misdemeanors.
What about last minute thoughts, different resources or things that maybe we didn't have a chance to talk about today that you think would be important for our listeners?
Well, I think it's important to listen to what's going on at the state legislatures because we have a lot of pushes right now to change crimes from felonies to misdemeanors. And as you do that, that's usually groups on one side of the spectrum trying to push change in bad ways. Because if it's a misdemeanor, look at what happened in California. They changed some felonies to misdemeanors. They did it by a petition drive, and the voters approved it. They were saying, "Oh, this will be good for criminals. They'll still have to answer for their misdemeanor crime, but it'll be able to help them find work." Well, after they changed theft under $950 to a misdemeanor in our urban areas, DAs decided they weren't going to prosecute that anymore. So theft under $950 was no longer a crime, or a crime that they would prosecute. And what's been the result of that? Stores closing because they can't withstand $25,000 a day of shoplifting. Businesses closing because they can't provide public safety for their employees. Businesses who are suffering graffiti every night are getting fined daily for not removing it. The government's not prosecuting the people doing it. They're prosecuting the businesses for not removing it. Businesses suddenly, like San Francisco, commercial buildings are selling for 25%, 30% of their value because nobody wants to be there. Businesses are moving. So just a decision to not prosecute theft under $950 has had a huge impact. And who does it hurt the most? The very communities they think or they claim they're trying to protect. I mean, grandma and grandpa who are retired living in an inner city on a fixed income don't have the ability to move. And now they've lost their pharmacy down the road. That now they have to travel further, and now they have to stick their necks out more and open to more attacks where, somebody in New York just decides to punch a little old lady walking by just to see if they can. Or in the subway, we got people with mental issues pushing people off in front of trains. And what do we do? What do we do about this? We have to be committed to public safety. We have to say we're going to have a safe community first and foremost, like you've said. And to do that, we have to address the issues that are important to us. We have to address domestic violence as a part of getting public safety, because not only does someone in Walmart deserve public safety, not only does some grandma and grandpa deserve public safety, but, wife with 2 kids who's getting beat up deserves public safety as well. And if we can't provide it, we'll demand it. The public will demand it. And that's where we are. The public is in the process of demanding it. We're in the process of pointing out that these groups that push for these reforms knew all along that their reforms would increase crime. And they thought it was okay as long as nobody knew. And, I do a podcast called The Bell Post, and you can find it at thebellpost.com. All we look at is criminal justice issues, bail reform type issues. We're intended to be informational, to give you a resource to find out, like what's the New Jersey plan. And we do that. We usually release 2 episodes a month. And we have the last 3 of our 4 episodes have all about people from California saying they knew they were going to increase crime. People from New York saying they knew they were going to increase crime. The sitting DA in Harris County, Houston, Texas, saying they knew what they were doing would increase crime. They didn't care. They had a political agenda. And so we've got to address that political agenda. Well, and we're always looking for groups to partner with the legislature. We usually partner with law enforcement groups and DA groups, but also victims' rights groups. And so, when we're in the middle of a legislative session and we see stuff that's going on, we reach out and we say, look, this is the issue. This is what they're trying to do. And if y'all want to provide written testimony, you can give it to us, and we can get it in the right hands so that they'll have a full picture of what's going on. And I think that partnership is so important as we're working through these issues until we get back to a time where public safety isn't a political issue. Both sides agree we need to have public safety. Now we just got one group saying, yeah, in name only, but they don't really mean it.
Well, Ken, this has been really insightful, and I am really looking forward to being able to share this with our listeners as well. I will make sure to have different things in the show notes for people to be able to find you or find those other resources that we discussed today also. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for listening to Unseen Pain. Be sure to follow to listen to more episodes. If you or a loved one has a story to share, please reach out to unseen.pain.podcast@gmail.com. I would love to be with you on your journey to share your story, because here, every story matters, every voice resonates, and healing becomes a beacon of possibility.